organized by Faculty of Economics, Business and Tourism, University of Split, and supported by Croatian section of European Region Science Association. Being developed in response to the changing needs, this webinar should represent an essential guide to understanding the key facts and offer a chance to ask questions, learn what others are doing, and gain advice how to make the best decision for our local regional community in post-corona period. Keeping in mind our goals, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Professor Peter Nijkamp. Professor Nijkamp is Emeritus Professor in Regional Urban Economics and Economic Geography at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. From 2009 to 2015, he was Honorary University Professor Science Association International. He is fellow of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Science and former vice president of this organization. In 1996, Peter Nijkamp was awarded the most prestigious scientific prize in the Netherlands, the Spinoza Award. Professor Nijkamp's main research interests covers plane evaluation, regional urban planning, transport system analysis, mathematical modeling of spatial systems, migration, technological innovation, and environmental research management. He has broad expertise in economics of public policy, service planning, infrastructure management, environmental management, and sustainable development. Finally, Peter is ambassador of the Faculty of Economics, Business and Tourism, and our dear friend. And therefore, it gives me great privilege to announce his speech today under the title, The Smart City as a Common Place for Tourists and Residents. Before we start, few technical and organizational tips. We will start with 30 minutes presentation, and after we will have time for at least 30 minutes for question and answer session. Please, just to be on safe side, turn off your camera or mute your microphone during the presentation. In your left corner, you have icons for that, so that we can have stable and smooth link with our speaker. After the presentation, you will be kindly asked to turn on your camera and microphone and start with the discussion. Thank you, and Peter, the stage is yours.
If I speak like this, everyone can hear me clearly?
Yes, yes.
Okay. If something happens, just let me know and then we'll fix it. So first of all, thank you so much. I'm very pleased that after almost 3 months of being more restricted in my academic moves, I can at least talk to people. It has been, for all of us, also for you, an unusual period. And I'm very happy that gradually all our countries are moving toward a better situation. Now, what I had in mind originally when Vinko asked me to talk to you is to present the paper which you have found on the link, and I guess everyone can easily download the paper, which was on the smart city as a common place for tourists and residents. But gradually, when time passed by, also in the past weeks, I thought it might be interesting to make a small move in the paper by orienting it also toward the city as a place for visitors and residents in the corona and post-corona time, so that we would also do some sort of a speculation on what we might expect and the issues involved when hopefully soon things will be back to normal, where I would make the argument already at the outset that perhaps it will be difficult to go back to normal. And that, of course, requires scientific efforts, and it requires policy efforts at all levels of government, including urban levels. And Split, of course, is one of the cities where the consequences of corona, also in the post-corona time, certainly will be observed. Now, having said this as an introduction, I have subdivided my speech in 3 major blocks, I would say, and I take 5 to 10 minutes for each block, and then I come up with a conclusion. And I will start first with the more general question on the city. I guess most of you will know that nowadays we talk very often about the sharing economy. The sharing economy is mainly instigated by internet, etc., so that we can share our resources through platforms. That can be the internet, that can be Uber, that can be also historically public transport, etc. Now, the sharing economy is not an altruistic economy. It's based on rational self-interest. Sharing economy means we share things, but not because we love others, but because it's better for ourselves. That is important to know. And the work of Jean Tirole, Nobel Prize laureate, and also one of the visitors at one of the recent big economist conferences in Split, has argued also in his writings that there is a rational system which determines the industrial organization through platforms. Now, from that perspective, the city then is not just a single object like a normal table or a pencil or so. A city is an organized way of people living together in a certain area. Not necessarily loving each other, but living together in a certain area. So the city is not based on altruism. It is based on sharing spaces for our joint interest. And there are different actors. And in the presentation today, I will make some sort of a stylized distinction between residents, including also businessmen, and visitors. And these could be tourists, recreationers, but also spectators of a football match or whatever. And if we see the city as a shared space, then of course the question is, what then at the end is the city? Now, in the current literature, there's still an ongoing debate on what is the city, what does it mean for residents and visitors. There's an ongoing debate, mainly centering on two angles. One is the orientation toward a statistical definition, where you might say, well, a city is anything, any settlement with more than 50,000, sometimes 100,000 people. Others would say, well, a city has a certain population density. And then, of course, you have to relate the population density toward the areal size, of course. And a city should be an adjacent area, and so on. So there are certain conditions which have often been specified in the literature on cities and definitional aspects and conceptualizations of cities. The EU has even a big program dealing with the question, how do we measure cities? Another one is that you might say, well, a city is not statistics, a city is economics. And that would mean that you would look much more into the functional composition of the urban economy. And that is well known in the literature nowadays as the FUA, functional urban areas, where mainly in the literature, at least the analytical literature, we look into the question, from which perspective is the city a unity? And in most pragmatic cases, then we say, well, let's look into a commuting distance. And if we define a city as an area where the intra-urban commuting volumes are higher than extra, then that's what we call a city. So that's mainly the current EU definition of what is the city. But others, of course, might look more carefully into what do we know about the city. It's not only the number of people, but also what kind of activities are taking place and where. Is the city the original historical settlement? Is the city including suburbs? Sometimes suburbs belong to the city administratively. Sometimes they are separate towns, etc. And so that means there is a lot of, let's say, ambiguity in the question, what do we see as the city? Also, what do we see as a tourist city? To give an example, in the UK, a city can be very small, up to, well, sometimes no more than 2,000 people, because a city in the UK constitution is defined as a settlement which has been granted city rights by the Crown, and mainly that was based on the question, is there historical cathedral in a certain place? If you have a historical cathedral, then the Crown, in this case the Queen, can grant you the right to call yourself a city. That has nothing to do with economics, nothing to do with social linkages in the city. That's one thing. So there is worldwide, if we are talking about increasing urbanization, there's enormous ambiguity and confusion on what is the city. It makes it even worse because, as you may know, United Nations has declared this century as the urban century because more than 50% of the people are living according to statistical definitions, ambiguous as they are in cities. But in many cases, we have seen an administrative reorganization or a merger of cities and villages. And if a village, which traditionally is belonging to the rural area, is merging with a city, then suddenly the rural area becomes an urban area. It has nothing to do with functionalities, it's just an administrative decision. And several countries, for instance, Spain, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, they have reorganized their municipal structures so as to create bigger cities. It has nothing to do with more people moving into the cities, it's just an administrative decision. So our current discussion on rapid urbanization ought to be interpreted against the background also of both definition of the city and the reorganization of the space in between cities. Of course, the EU approach might make some sense. We say, well, a city is a functional economic unity. But the question there is, what is functional and what is economic? Pragmatically, very often we take commuting distances, but why should be commuting the main criterion? Most of the flows in a city, that's also what we know from Emmanuel Castells, most of the flows in a city are not commuting flows. They are leisure flows, they are shopping flows, social flows, educational flows, parents taking children to school or from school to home. So any criterion we would choose there also has a lot of, let's say, ambiguities. And you might even go a step further. If a city is based on functional interactions, then especially among the younger generation, most of the interactions nowadays are not anymore physical, but are virtual in nature. And of course, the past Corona months have demonstrated clearly that we can work from home wherever we live. We need not go to the university, we need not go to work, at least in several cases. So it means that physical interaction is not by necessity the decisive criterion for what is the city. And that is something which in the post-corona time certainly will have dramatic implications on the way we look into cities. Now, if we go back to the literature, in fact, I cannot resist to mention three important people who have written extensively on all these issues. And by coincidence, but just a sheer coincidence, they all have the same family name, namely Weber, W-E-B-E-R, Weber. And the first person who wrote about cities and statistics in cities was Adna Weber. It's slightly a German name, but he was living in the US. And he was the first one who has written a whole book on the statistics of cities, how to describe a city, looking into cadastral data, into population data, and migration data, etc., densities. That is already more than 130 years ago. The second person, the same family name, but a different first name, was Max Weber. And I guess most of you will be familiar with Max Weber. Max Weber was the famous German sociologist, in my view, the most important sociologist in Europe and maybe worldwide from the last century, well known for his very thorough sociological contributions. But he has written one book on the city. The title is The City. And that's approximately 100 years ago, 1920 more or less. And he claims the city has nothing to do with statistics. The city is a social construct. He was a sociologist. He said the city is a social construct. What we feel about the city is how we construct the city, and that is what the city is. Then we have a third person, also is the family name Weber, Alfred Weber. So we have Adna Weber, Max Weber.
Aha, je, sad ću ja pojačat kako mi treba. Pa mislim da je to. Da, upravo se odvija. Ovo je prekriženo start video, šta ovo tu dole niže.
Can I continue now? So the third person is Alfred Weber. And he took an economic perspective. So we have a statistical perspective, the first Weber, the second Weber, a sociological perspective, the third one is an economic perspective. The city is defined by economic functionings. So this is my first part of my speech on the smart city and the city as the host for economic activities. And that brings me to the second part of my presentation, i.e., one of the functions, the economic and social functions, also described in statistics of a city, is tourism. And tourism has become, as all of us know, and certainly our friends in Splitu will know, has become one of the drivers of economic growth. Tourism used to be rather, let's say, specific and only meant for the happy few in the past, but now tourism has become from the happy few, the happy many. And that has to do also with the fact that in our mobile society, transportation costs have gone down, and leisure time has gone up, economic welfare has gone up. So we see tourism very often as some sort of what is nowadays called an experience society and part of an experience economy. That first idea of tourism as an experience economy has already been advocated in the 1960s, so a little bit more than 50 years ago, by a German geographer, Walter Kristaller. And he did a very thorough analysis of the upcoming tourism. Tourism by then was not studied at all. He was a geographer, a well-known geographer from Germany, dealing with central place theory, but he saw increasingly also the upcoming tourism as the major economic sector impacting on cities. And he said tourism goes for the things which you have never seen and would like to see, the experience economy. Now, in the meantime, tourism has become a very important sector for many countries and certainly for many cities. That holds, of course, for Split, that holds for Dubrovnik and many other places in Croatia. That has also been reflected in the economics of tourism, the tourism-led growth, TLG, tourism-led growth, where welfare of countries, regions, and cities is increasingly depending on the flows of tourists. Sometimes not only tourism in itself, but also the attractiveness of nature. So then you would have nature-led growth or culture, and then you would have culturally led growth. So all these elements in combination have made modern tourism as a dominant engine for growth in many cities all over the world. And that has been an ongoing development in the past 30 to 40 years. And during the economic crisis, or some 10 years back, tourism has been hit a little bit, but it has never shown a decline. It was still at a certain stable level, and now it was flourishing very fast. And until recently, let's say 3-4 months ago, everyone would predict that tourism will be showing an uninterrupted growth. We had scenarios on millions of Chinese tourists visiting all places in the world, flooding all cities, tourist cities, etc. And based on the question of income, the question of low transportation costs, etc. Some sort of a flying carpet. In various cases, tourism was so cheap that you could almost freely move from one place to the other one. Of course, that has prompted questions already in the past. The first question, of course, is where does the money go? If a few million of tourists visit every year Split, does it mean that these millions of tourists would spend all their money in Split, or would the money go to, let's say, tourism organizations abroad? That makes a big difference. So even the spending does not necessarily mean that all the money ends up in the locality of tourism. Club Méditerranée is a well-known example. TUI is another example. So gradually we have seen some more doubts on the economic importance for the locals, at least, not on a worldwide scale, but for the locals, and are they getting better off? And that has prompted lots of research on the positive income effects, on the employment effects, seasonable, etc., also for students, for instance, and increasingly also on the housing market, certainly with the advent of Airbnb and other platform economies, which have meant an enormous boost in economic tourism. So there's a first question already. A second, of course, is that with the mass tourism, especially in historical cities, look at Venice, Rome, Amsterdam, Stockholm, London, etc., the scarce public space becomes more and more crowded, to the extent that it's not only crowded, but there's hardly any space left for the locals and for the residents, and certainly during the 4 to 6 months of high tourist season. And that has already led to quite a lot of criticism in the past years on mass tourism in our historical cities. Cities tend to lose their character. We have seen the revolt in Venice, where governments have decided that to enter Venice, you have to pay an entrance fee so as to regulate a little bit the entry. You can, of course, raise tourist taxes in these cities and so on. But nevertheless, the residents still feel that they lose the character of their place in the tourist season. Venice is one of the most illustrative examples. Many Venice people escape during the summer period and have a second house in the mountain area around the north of Venice because it's unbearable. And that makes the positive tone on tourism slightly more nuanced. And this is not only the overcrowdedness, it's small things, lots of noise. In some cities nowadays, you cannot use a a bag on wheels during the nighttime, because that also the old city of Split, because it wakes up almost everyone if people move around with bags of wheels during the nighttime. Simple things, but they all count. And that brings us into the fundamental question, which we will see increasingly emerging, i.e., the city, yes, is a shared space, it's a public space, but there is a friction among public space. And in the theory of public economics, of course, we know there is, in many cases, free entry. So without any exclusion, everyone can enter a street, everyone can enter a square. But if it leads to over-congestion and negative externalities, a regulatory system has to be put in place. And that is something we know already from ancient history. I guess some of you or most of you will be familiar with the tragedy of the commons, written by Hardin, a book already quite many decades ago, where he looks into the over-exploitation. If all people would have a common pasture where they can send in their sheep or their cows, if everyone sends in too many cows, of course, at the end there's no space for the cows and the sheep to live, or they cannot make an economic living out of it. So you need to regulate the market, either through price mechanisms or through regulatory entry systems. So that's in fact where we are, where we were almost in terms of the debate and also the research, which prompted indeed the question, is the city there? Not only what is the city, but is the city there for the residents or is the city there for the visitors? And that is a tension which needs to be solved soon. Now, there are two more intervening factors, and I get back to the paper and some of the research and results. There are a couple of intervening factors. In the first place, thanks to the internet and digital technology, it has become much easier to enter any city as a tourist on Earth. You can get all information on the internet of a city, the places to go, and what you might expect in a city. The city is around the corner, wherever you are in the world. You have electronic booking systems, makes it very easy to go everywhere. You have information systems, you have route guidance systems, and you have many more things, which makes it so easy for visitors to go to any place on Earth. And certainly, if you believe in the experience economy, to go to attractive cities which have unique cultural heritage assets. And Split and Dubrovnik, etc., is one of them, but there are hundreds of these beautiful places all over Europe. A second intervening factor, which has come up even more recently, is the use of booking systems, and in particular booking platforms, and more in particular Airbnb. Airbnb is, in a way, economically, is a nice way, elegant way of trying to find private housing in any city. But it has also prompted a lot of negative externalities. We have seen the protests in Barcelona against Airbnb. People were almost forced to rent their house through these platforms. The visitors came and the locals were almost driven out. And we see this increasingly in many places. So what you offer in terms of private housing for visitors means that you cannot use it for the locals. And we see these devastating examples, for instance, in London nowadays, a big tourist destination. To find, if you are a student in London, you cannot find at any decent price an apartment anymore in London. You have to travel at least 1 or 1.5 hours to find an apartment. And it's partly to do with the tension on the housing market caused by renting out private houses to foreign visitors. So what we see increasingly is a tension between, again, the locals, the residents, including students, and what we have in terms of the demand of Airbnb visitors. And I get back to that point in a minute. Now, in the paper which we have distributed to all of you, and you can find the link, I guess, we have tried to look into all these issues of the quality of the housing market, the livability in cities, and the environmental quality. And in the paper which you have, I think, got access to, there we made a comparative analysis of some 40 world cities all over the world, big cities like Tokyo, Shanghai, but also smaller cities like Copenhagen or Stockholm, etc. Cities in all continents, 40 cities. Split was not on the list, but and there might be another exercise and recent ones to do this because it contains a lot of insightful material. And it turns out that the higher the penetration rate of digital technology is in cities, the more it attracts visitors and tourists. And of course, it certainly adds to the economic welfare of the city. So the economic model works very well. The question whether that is always sustainable is a different question. And that remains to be seen, because it's not always clear that big floods of tourists would lead to higher sustainability, environmental quality, maintenance of cultural heritage, urban ambience, historical character, etc. And in our paper then we have tried to use all these statistics. There was a big statistical database from all these cities over various years. We have used standard techniques like factor analysis and principal component analysis, put them together in a structural equation model. It's all documented in the paper. And then we had to identify the question, what are the driving factors? Which factors determine then the growth of these cities? And then it turns out that cultural interaction, or culture in general, cultural amenities, are a driving factor, the first one. And second, accessibility. Now that is interesting, because if you draw that lesson for Split, then of course it is immediately evident, even though Split was not on our list of cities to be investigated, but the lessons are very clear. Split has a fantastic portfolio of historical assets, so culture, yes, so that's a driving force. And increasingly, the airport is improving. The new airport certainly offers more facilities. So the two things are an attraction pole in terms of willingness to visit of tourists to Split, but it's also, of course, the danger, because the balance between the economy and sustainability and cultural ambience might get lost. Now that brings me to a final point which I would like to discuss with you, because if we now look into our world since the beginning of this year, let's say February, March, where the coronavirus also affected Europe, then we see a series of rather dramatic changes. And we did some research on the type of changes which we could observe. First point is that until beginning of March, we were more or less believing in some sort of an unlimited and almost uncontrolled growth. Mass tourism, we might expect more crowdedness in cities. We might anticipate loss of atmosphere. We might have more negative externalities because of too many visitors. To give an example, we did in a previous study a research on the waiting time. If you order a beer in a cafe, normally that if there are no tourists, that would take maybe 1 minute. And if there are tourists, it might take 4 to 6 minutes. You would say, well, what is 4 to 6 minutes compared to 1 minute? But locals do not want to wait 4 to 6 minutes, and that already is a first sign of a tension between tourists and locals. So to control an unlimited entry of tourists, of course, there are a couple of measures. You could say higher tourist taxes. Demand will also lead to higher hotel prices and accommodation prices. You might have supply restrictions. Supply restrictions were until recently not very popular, but gradually I think we will get to that point because now we are more used to it because of the fact that in the Corona time there were supply restrictions, even prohibitions, and they were accepted. But nowadays we even have supply restrictions for entries to the beach, for entries to a cafe, for entries to a restaurant, for entries to a museum. These are all pure supply restrictions. 30 people in a restaurant, 100 people in a church, and what have you, all kinds of measures. And gradually, apparently, we have accepted, in contrast to the past, supply restrictions. And I would not be surprised if these types of regulatory systems would also be introduced in busy tourist cities. And I give you one example. Airbnb had a big market in the city of Amsterdam. And gradually it led to a distortion of the housing market. Young people could not afford housing anymore. No one could get a house anymore because everything was rented out to the tourists. The city council, already before Corona, by the way, had already decided that there would be a rationing and a supply restriction. You cannot, if you're the full owner of a house, you cannot rent it for the whole year or half of a year to a visitor. A maximum is 3 weeks to 4 weeks. Can that be controlled? Yes, because everything is put on the internet. So Airbnb, all the information on Airbnb, the vacancies, the period of vacancy, the pricing, etc., everything can be found on the internet. The city of Amsterdam has some 20 people now employed to sort out all the facilities. They have to pay taxes, etc. In the past, they didn't. So everything is carefully controlled, and through that internet system, you can control also the entry. So that's an important element already. So there was already a first turning point. That's the first point. The second point, of course, in March with the unexpected and unanticipated rise of corona infections, many cities were almost locked down. Even when people wanted to go, if there is no flight, if there is no public transport, etc., you cannot move around. So it meant suddenly a total collapse. That was not, and the corona, of course, was not a political decision, but the political decision was to restrict, of course, free movement of people so as to control the spread of COVID-19. And so that has lasted now for almost 3 years. Many cities, if you look also into the, we did quite some, in the past months, quite some investigations into the Airbnb facilities in terms of pricing and vacancy and availability, a dramatic collapse of the whole market. Now we get gradually, that's what we have found out in the past 10 to 14 days, gradually cities start to open again a little bit, and not completely, but it has, in our first analysis, dramatic implications for the tourist market in cities. It turns out that hotels are not seen anymore as safe havens in case of the coronavirus. Many hotels, and we have checked some of the data, even for the coming summer, have an occupancy rate of maybe 10 to 20%. People do not trust hotels because they are advised everywhere where there is a crowd of people, it's dangerous, don't go there. That holds for market squares, that holds, of course, for terraces, everyone has to be dispersed. And people feel that hotels are not always a safe place. Whether or not it's correct, it doesn't matter. But that's the fact of life. Hotels are really having enormous, big trouble in getting even a small slice of the market attracted. Then you might ask, what will happen with Airbnb, which also saw the same type of collapse? Now, then we have to know that Airbnb covers different market segments. It covers the market segment of shared, that's where shared society and shared economy comes up, a shared apartment where you can live with different individuals in one and the same apartment. And then what we have found out already in the past 10 days is that that segment of the market is hardly attracting any interest because people feel that it is not safe. If you share an apartment with unknown people, not your own family, unknown people, different rooms, but still you share it, that's not very helpful. But what we see tentatively is an enormous rise in Airbnb facilities which are separate apartments, only for one family. And you rent it for yourself as a family or as a couple or whatever. And that is safe, seen as safe. So we see increasingly small enclaves coming up. So the bigger hotels also in Spain have great difficulties in getting bookings. But Airbnb facilities as separate apartments, they might in the future, and certainly the immediate future, be the more attractive places for tourists once the cities will be opening up after the lockdown situation. Now, my assessment is that this is not only a temporary thing. I guess the shared spaces in cities, also by tourists, they will enjoy less crowdedness as a sake of self-interest of visitors. And it would be easier for local authorities to control that market because we have learned from the coronavirus that we can control social systems where there are too many people at the same place. And of course, the rigorous lockdown was maybe very much a rigorous decision, but traces of lockdown in terms of restricted entry to cities in case of overcrowdedness of cities by tourists, I think, will certainly be attractive options for many people. I've seen also on the television various interviews with authorities and people in Barcelona, Paris, and you get almost the same what has been said during the Brexit discussion in the UK. Give us our city back. And locals will try to get more and more of their share back of the urban economy. And I will conclude this with a simple example, but it was just the past weeks decided by the city of Amsterdam. Any new shop in the city will not get a permission unless it serves the locals. So a regular tourist shop with all kinds of cheap tourist goods, etc., a regular fast food shop, etc., it will not be allowed to get an entry permit. New shops or a replacement of existing shops by other shops will only be permitted if they serve to a large extent the locals. So going back then to where I started, yes, the city is an important meeting place of people. That's where residents and visitors come together. And the balance maybe has been lost in the past years to the benefit of the visitors and to the detriment of the residents. And my conclusion is that as a positive side effect of the corona crisis, there is now an option to find a much better balance between the residents and the interest of the residents and the interest of tourists. More spreading and more respect for each other's interests. So I see this as a rather new perspective, where I think in the post-corona time, we will see different modalities for city governments in the light of the age of leisure and tourism. That will certainly be there, but it requires a different governance system. I think I will stop here, Vinko. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's perfect. It's perfect.
Okay, good.
Oh, thank you, Peter, on exceptional presentation. Now I will invite colleagues to take opportunity and ask the questions. Before asking, I will kindly suggest my colleagues to send their questions in the chat room so that we can have effective discussion. Of course, before they start with the questions, it would be really nice if they can introduce themselves. So maybe just to mention their names and the background. Okay?
Very good.
Let's start.
Okay.
The first question, okay, we have 56 participants, so definitely we will have lots of questions.
Hello, Vinko, am I allowed to speak? Lydia is here.
Yeah, good to see you, Lydia.
I must use the opportunity to say hello to you. It's so nice to see you again, and thank you for the wonderful.
Very nice, very nice.
As always, just to break the ice. Peter, whether you expect that these trends of, let's say, shutting down the doors of the cities to the visitors, I mean, not literally, is expected to be more intense in the European cities, or you expect them to be as such also in the rest of the world? I mean, Europe is the most touristic region in the world still. So what do you think, whether all the parts of the world will follow the same trend?
Europe, of course, is the main focal point of international tourism, and it has an enormous portfolio of beautiful assets. And of course, it's nice to share all these assets with other people. And they, to some extent, are right in visiting Europe. But at the same time, one ought to appreciate that to maintain the historical, cultural heritage of cities, while still respecting also the fact that the city is also the home of residents, that requires a balance. And what we have seen also over the past years in our research, the resistance against the imbalance is increasing. And but people always have said, well, it will be difficult to control all these flows. But my counter argument now is that during the corona time, we have seen that it is possible to control even very radically flows. Well, with some modest control mechanism, it should be possible, in my view, and that would also be, in my view, mentally acceptable, to control tourist flows. And that holds for visitors to cultural heritage assets, of course, but it also holds in terms of rationing our visits during the nighttime, for instance, because the locals are the ones who do not want to suffer. And do not forget that locals are increasingly recognizing their power, because they vote the city council. And that is a mechanism which has been sometimes, got undersnowed maybe, but gradually they, not only citizens, want to have their city back, they also will get their control back. And a strategic policymaker certainly would look into, well, these new trends, which absolutely will have an impact.
Thank you, Lydia. And now we have a question from Vedran Barbaric, Head of Art History Department, Faculty of Humanities and Social Science, University of Split. So, Vedran, if you like, you may ask the question. Okay. Before Vedran, if Vedran is still with us, but I will ask the question because we have it in our chat room. Few years ago, Peter, you were on the one of the speakers at the seminar organized by the Faculty of Economics in Split. When asked for possible existence of models and actions in tackling the over-tourism effects in historic centers, you have mentioned the first measures are being introduced in the centers like Amsterdam, Barcelona, like limiting the numbers of bed and breakfast. Have you been able to track the results and effects of such measures? Can we say today that there exists some kind of applicable model of solutions?
Yes. One ought to know that in the urban century, cities in any case are attractive economic and social magnets for people to live, to work, to entertain, and so on. But at the same time, cities benefit from tourism and visitors and international business and what have you. But the balance, of course, at some stage got somewhat lost, because if cities are used by tourists as new colonial places where you can exploit certain things and then you leave it behind without caring that much on the social and cultural and natural and ecological consequences, that is not a good model. And if one looks into the economic model, that in a pure cost-benefit sense, that would work. But if we would introduce also on the cost side, the social and cultural historical disadvantages, difficult as they are to assess, then it's not so sure that the cost-benefit mechanism would work out that well. And especially it might not work out very well for the locals. So there is an increasing interest among locals to insist that the city is in fact their residence, and visitors are in fact guests and are not the owners. So what I see is essentially a shift in the question. First, what is the city and how does a city function, into the question, who owns the city? And who owns the city is a power question. And my guess is, and also my first experience is, that people would like to take the city back and will use their power through democratic systems so as to force local leaders at least not to forget that the residents make up for the city for 12 months a year and not for a few weeks a year. So, and as I said before, the current past months have led to an acceptance of rather strict rules on the use of public space. In fact, in many cities, it was even forbidden to use the public space. That's a very rigorous governance system, of course. Maybe that ought to be done, even though not in all countries. In our country, was a little bit more liberal in this respect. But in general, and it has been accepted. And since tourists do not vote, that's an important mechanism. Residents vote, tourists do not vote. And if residents want to take back their power, then of course it will lead to a completely different governance also of overcrowded tourist places in Europe. and they ought to be protected. Lydia also mentioned this. We have such a rich historical cultural heritage in Europe, unique in the world, and that in one way or another ought to be protected at all costs.
Thank you. We have another question from my dear colleague Anna Rimac-Smiljanic. The topic, the future of housing in touristic attractive cities. Anna.
Hello to everybody. Professor, thank you for a lovely presentation. I have a question for you in an area which I'm personally interested in. It is about housing in the cities which are interested for tourists. How to combine these two interests? Is it better to develop measurements to limit new supply of housing transformed to the tourists? Or it's better to build new areas for housing, new apartment buildings and so on? Which is your experience in the cities which implement some measures to block new supply of apartments for tourists? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Cities are meant to house citizens, but not all cities can house all the citizens who want to have a house in the city, unless you build compact cities or unless you use the three-dimensional space, which means higher-rise buildings. But that is not something which can be done. Split is a good example there, because the old city center, there must be strict building regulations, and you cannot build a skyscraper in the middle of the old city. But the apartment buildings outside, at the edge of the city, of course, have become more or less the model in many other cities as well. If you need to accommodate more people, you cannot accommodate all of them in the old city area, but you can at least accommodate them in the urban area, but then you have to go in a third dimension. And that has become more or less not only the model in Split or Dubrovnik, but we see this in almost all historical cities. There are only a few cities in Europe which are building skyscrapers in the middle of the city. And that can be done, for instance, Frankfurt, but that was destroyed during the war, so it makes it easier. It can be done in Berlin, the same. It has been done in the city of Rotterdam, but that was also destroyed in the war. So after the war, you have more open space, and then if you choose that model, that can be done. But there's another element one ought to appreciate. If you are living in a historical city, and if you are owning a house in a historical city and close to a monument, the value of that house is much higher than the same house without any monument in the vicinity or without any cultural heritage structure in the vicinity. We have done quite some empirical research to find out the markup, so the extra price you would get for a house if the house is located close to a monument. And that's approximately and there are also international studies by the World Bank, by the way, that's approximately in between 20 and 30%. So you get a bonus if you are lucky enough to have a house close to a historical monument or in the historical area of the city. But now comes the point, because that explains part of the resistance. If you have a house in a historical city, and if your neighbor has decided to turn his house into an Airbnb facility, then during the nighttime there will be dozens of people partying all night, etc. And that significantly decreases again the house value. So it's not only a question of give us our city back, we want to not to have all the business dominating the public streets, it's also a matter of private interest. An Airbnb facility, and there has been quite some research, also some review research recently, means that a house price can easily go down with 10 to 20%. And no one, of course, compensates you for that loss. So there's not only, let's say, the public space argument, there's also the private property argument, which in combination lead to the conclusion that city governments nowadays feel that, irrespective of visitors, houses in the cities are for the residents. And only if for a few weeks you can rent out your house if you're on holidays or so or whatever, that's fine. But if whole housing blocks are only used for visitors, and the city then next has to build new social housing outside of the city, so that's your question, that is an imbalance. And that's where gradually I think many cities will take back the power on local housing markets.
Thank you for the answer.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Peter. We have a next question. This question by Smiljana Pičević, Head of Tourism Economic Department from our faculty. Smiljana, please.
Hello, everybody, and hello, Peter. Welcome.
Hi.
Welcome online to our faculty.
Yes,
once
I'd
again.
like to see you in person, but next time.
It is better, but we are managing.
Okay, very good.
So, very nice presentation. Thank you. Interesting. And what my question is related to what we have heard recently in a webinar that was held by your colleague, our second ambassador, Professor Rodrigo Spose. He was talking about the quality of institutions and the importance of institutions' quality in the overall development. And he has given some data evidence that the quality of institutions is one of the most determining factors for the development. So when we know that, and when we know that Croatia is performing very badly, unfortunately, in institution quality, and on the other hand, Croatia is the country mostly dependent on tourism in economic terms within the European Union, my question is, how do you yourself see the future of managing tourism in this situation? Meaning those who need to manage it are doing very badly their job, and we are depending totally economically on tourism. So what is the future for us? It looks very bad. So how do you see it?
I'm less pessimistic, but you are right. Quality of institutions is an important parameter in the whole process. But in the wake of the rapid tourist development in the past 20, 30 years in many countries, and uncontrolled, more or less we have assumed that this was always a good thing. Tourist-led growth was one of the recipes also for fast development, advocated also by national governments, EU, World Bank, and so on. But these were anonymous market forces. And it means essentially we have to go back to a new balance. I'm absolutely sure that will happen. But a new balance will require two things. On the one hand, an alert attitude of citizens, and second, the creation of alert institutions. Now, what I would assume is gradually people will insist and also impose on their local authorities that the previous uncontrolled growth was not always the best one. And of course, one can call this weak institutions. I don't know whether this is a weak institution because they just follow the market. And but I guess we are moving rapidly toward new tides. And in this tidal movement, I think a alert governance structure and alert policymakers will carefully listen to the people. And do not forget that one ought to make also a careful analysis of the benefits of uncontrolled tourism for the locals. and the assessment of all the flows is difficult to make. Are we sure that all the flows are, or most of the flows are ending up with the locals? No, we are not. I give you one example, personal example, but then we know what we're talking about. I have last year spent some time in an Airbnb facility in the neighborhood of Split. That was an Airbnb facility owned by a Croatian couple, but living in Germany. And they wanted to buy a big villa in Germany, and to finance that villa, they tried to get as much money as possible from renting an Airbnb facility in Croatia to Germans, you see? Mm-hmm. So whether this is a balanced situation ought to be seen, because half of the year that house is empty. And what is an empty city? Half of the year. So that means that, in my view, gradually we will see the plea and the right plea of locals that a more balanced development is necessary. A city is not an exploitation area in an old colonial sense. And so I think the Corona time again has taught us important lessons and also control mechanisms.
Okay, so you kind of see it coming organically from the people who are, let's say, seeing things differently, and then expecting and demanding from institutions to move it that way.
Yeah,
that's how you see it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. To illustrate this, in 1972, Barbara Ward, an American author, wrote a very interesting book. It's almost 50 years old, but the title of the book is already illustrative. It's called, on cities, it's called The Home of Man. The Home of Man. And that means essentially people should feel home in their own city. Mm-hmm. And maybe that has been neglected at some stage in the past decades, but that is now coming back. The appreciation for the local environment, I think, is now a rapid force in many cities.
Thank you, Peter, and nice to see
you. Okay, good.
Okay, we have a next question. First, I think that Professor Lydia Petric was asking the second part of her question, but it's also in line with the Smilja question. So it's about the capacity of citizens to address their needs, and especially to address their needs in long term. Lydia, would you like maybe to ask the second part of your question, or we may give a floor to Josip? Okay, let's give a floor to Josip now. Josip Viskovic, still from our faculty. Josip, please ask your question. Josip is not able to ask, so I will ask you, Peter.
Okay.
Josip was asking, you mentioned example of Amsterdam with giving permission only to those who provide services to locals. How is that in line with the free market? What was the reaction of local shop owners?
Yeah. As I said before, first you need a local support, and second, you need to intervene in the real estate market. In the period of, let's say, a liberal urban economy, everything was left to the market. The city has now decided that in the main streets in the old center, as far as these are facility streets, shopping streets, etc., they will try to acquire maybe at least 10% of all the real estate back. They will buy it. And you cannot sell a real estate anymore. You have to sell it first, or to offer it first to the local authority, and they will decide whether they will buy it or not. And then they will decide what they will do with it. So if local authorities have a stake, not 100%, that would be a communist time, but even 10%, that's a significant part of a control mechanism for local real estate in the major shopping streets. If the city owns 10%, then already you have a major impact, which is far more than 10%, on the total of transactions and functionings of shopping streets. But it requires a proactive government, and when we are talking about institutions, yes, that's of course where the institutional capability of local governance is excessively important.
Thank you, Peter. Any other question?
I would like to comment, if I can, please.
Definitely.
Okay, this proposition to city to involve more on the local real estate market and the right to buy properties if they are sold. What about situation when the local government doesn't have money for do such a thing? For example, in Split, this right to buy first some real estate in the local center of the city, historical, already exists. But in many times, the city of Split doesn't have in budget money to buy such types of interesting real estate. What to do then?
Mm-hmm. You see, buying real estate by the public sector is not just not spending money, because it's an asset. So what you do is you use that specific real estate asset to turn it into a different function. You can rent it out next to others, even on a commercial basis. But it means you can control the function used in that real estate. So it's a control mechanism. It does not necessarily mean that you would lose money, because any private developer could do the same and he would also make money out of it. So that's, of course, you get, of course, an interesting discussion. Is it the role of public authorities to be involved in the real estate market? But we know that if the government has no stake in the real estate market, it is a victim of anonymous market forces. And so together with all these things, gradually we move back to, let's say, what the French would call a concerted economy, where there ought to be a balance between public sectors and private demands. And so a more pronounced and active involvement of local authorities, I think, in the sake of the protection of the atmosphere and the cultural heritage of the city, I think is needed. And that's what we know already from, the whole theory on the tragedy of the commons. And so, in fact, we go almost back to Hardin's wisdom of more than 50 years ago, and it's the same mechanism. And we have neglected this to a large extent, but now it comes back. Good.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So maybe I can ask one question. It's in line with Lydia's question. So Peter, what kind of social capital do we need if we want to have balanced, coexisting life of tourism and sustainable development in the small and medium cities like Split? Because we were talking before about the quality of government. Mostly we were talking about formal aspects. But what kind of social capital, informal institutions do we need for some effective results?
If I would follow Walter Kristaller's argument some 50 years ago on the experience economy, then in many cases, the social capital inside the city, so the residents, is an important one. Second, if there is this local identity, foreigners certainly would like to be also confronted with or to hear more about local identities. There are many people, and also hold certainly in the Split area, but also in many other places, they are very proud of their city, they like their city, but they also expect that city life is respected and that is treated with, some good feeling of maintenance and sustainability. And this coexistence of locals and tourists is always a balance. Now, if the the tourists are not the dominant users of public space, it's easy to get a balance. But if the streets, if the squares, if all restaurants, if all beaches are completely dominated by visitors, then it means essentially there is no place anymore for the residents. And somehow we have to find a balance. We have to spread tourism more. And I would not argue tourism is a bad thing. It's a fantastic financial source of revenues and welfare. But the balance, I think, in many cases is totally lost. And that is not a good thing. Those of you who have ever been in Saint-Tropez in France, and on the Mediterranean Sea in the summer, they will know that you only have 2 square meters per person on the beach. And that is something which has destroyed the whole atmosphere. And somehow we need to ration this in terms of season, in terms of time of the day, and many other things, etc. Otherwise, the tourism will just be seen as a force which will destroy many places. And in the longer run, and we are now almost in a turning point in my view, in the longer run, democracy will tell us that citizens will take back their power and force authorities to control the system. And we see this in many Western European cities increasingly. Venice is also a good example. Barcelona, of course, is a good example. And we will get many more of these examples. So the combination of balance and, let's say, institutional capability is essential.
Thank you, Peter. So we have time maybe for the last question. Do we have a last question or? Okay.
Vinko, may I?
Okay.
Sorry, I was writing one type of a question and then I will get to another one. Okay, I'm listening carefully what you are talking, but well, we have here the question, dilemma, what is first, the chicken or the egg? So the countries like Croatia leaning too much on tourism development is always in a kind of corona pandemic situation. I mean, tourism pandemic situation. So, but the real question is, what do you think if the main problem with the countries prioritizing tourism in a way that we do is the lack of the overall general strategy, the very idea on where to go, or it is just, you know, like letting yourself down the water and tourism is here and let us use it and, you know, just a little comment.
In the economics literature, we have the phenomenon of what we call the Dutch disease. Mm-hmm. And the Dutch disease essentially was the fact that suddenly and unplanned we found a lot of natural gas in the northern part of the country. And that made us a little bit lazy. And the degree of innovativeness went down because we could rely on our natural gas. It was even exported. Well, part of the good news is that this natural gas will soon close down because we had too many earthquakes in the area. And also there are environmental reasons. So now we are importing natural gas from Russia, another political issue. But it was cheap money in a way. And you might say you have some sort of a Croatian disease. The Croatian disease is you find a resource, which is the sun and the beach. It is there. You have not invested in it. It's there, right? And you just use it. And it makes you, of course, it gives you a good feeling. And undoubtedly that is nice. But it also makes it much more simple, to forget about the future. Because there is no country which forever will always have the same economic structure, the same economic resources. And even though the sun will always be there, but the sun will be everywhere. So gradually, each country should use also the free resources, whether it's natural gas, sun or beach, as a stepping stone for a strategic view on where do we want to be in 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Will we have circular economies? Will we have all kinds of other types of technological and economic models for our cities, our regions, our country? And so I would argue, Lydia, to avoid the disadvantages we have been facing in the Netherlands with the Dutch disease, it might be time to avoid gradually also the Croatian disease and think more strategically ahead. That would be my advice.
I completely agree with you, but that is why I was asking this question, because I don't see that anyone is looking ahead in a way that you are suggesting. I mean, there are some strategic issues that are discussed in the society, but I don't think not yet in the real way. So tourism is still the option, but every now and then when something happens like this, now we are in a problem. So yeah. I agree with you, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter, on outstanding presentation. Exceptional webinars require more than just a great presentation. They need valuable content and, importantly, engage viewers. And I think that we had it all today. So thank you everyone. I hope you will join us on our next webinar.
Well, thank you so much, and hope to see you also in person soon, because I still feel the personal contact, despite the sophisticated webinars, but the personal contact is still the best. So I hope to show up soon again in Split.
See you in Split soon.
Okay, all the best then. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.